For many, fantasy playoffs are on the line this week. Win and you're in, lose, and it's time to come up with a contingency plan heading into the 2025 season. The problem facing many managers with their seasons on the line, 6 teams on a bye this week. That just when you need them the most. Back in August, week 14 buys, nobody cared about them. They didn't mean anything. However, the thought of replacing Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor, Brian Robinson Jr., Ramondre Stevenson, it is a daunting task. Heck, you can't even use Broncos backs to replace them even if you wanted to, which, by the way, I would strongly never recommend. Now, difficult decisions will need to be made once again this week, and we are here to help you with this week's RotoBaller starts and sits for the running back position. Starting with those fantasy football booms, and starting with Tony Pollard of the Tennessee Titans as they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. At this point, I should be paying Tony Pollard an appearance fee for how often I am talking about him on this show. Look no further if you're looking for a running back with upside and a great matchup. Pollard is averaging 13.6 fantasy points per game this season, and he is currently the RB21 with 163 PPR points. If not for that fumble last week, Pollard would have posted 10 or more fantasy points in 7 of his previous 9 contests. In a game that quickly got out of hand, Pollard, he still managed to finish with 35 rushing yards there on his 8 attempts while adding 33 yards on 4 receptions. Even with Tajay Spears back in the backfield, Pollard accounted for 92% of the opportunities out of the Titans' backfield. In the 4 games that Pollard had the backfield without Spears, Pollard was the RB3, averaging 100.5 yards per game. Pollard's receiving upside puts him in line for a potential top 12 finish this week amongst the running back position. The Jaguars are allowing the 4th most receiving yards to running backs this season, having allowed 556 yards and 4 touchdowns. Only the Carolina Panthers have allowed more fantasy points per game this season than the 28.41 that the Jacksonville Jaguars are surrendering. Over the last 4 weeks, that number, it has jumped to a league high 33.77 as Jacksonville has allowed 623 total yards and 5 touchdowns. My second running back this week I'm starting, it's Kyren Williams of the Los Angeles Rams taking on the Buffalo Bills. I wasn't worried about Kyren Williams and his fumbles until I was, because Blake Corum, he played a season high 32% of snaps. He was the first dog out of the backfield there. As Sean McVay, he sent a very clear fatherly message to Williams early on in this one. However, after that, it was back to Williams doing what he does best. And after the Rams' second drive, he accounted for 14 of the 17 remaining carries out of the backfield, turning that into a touchdown and 101 rushing yards. Everyone wants Corum to be a thing. The truth is, that is unlikely to happen as Williams was the only back to catch a pass out of the backfield there and the only back to have carries inside the 10-yard line on Sunday. This Sunday, look for plenty of opportunities as Williams faces the Buffalo Bills team that has allowed 1,218 rushing yards and 6 scores to backs this season. They've also surrendered 569 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns on 72 receptions. Add that all up, 27.23 fantasy points per game. In the snow, Jordan Mason and Christian McCaffrey combined for 131 rushing yards on 20 attempts in a contest that seemingly faded the 49ers run game out of the game script. Now, speaking of those 49ers, let's keep it going with Isaac Guerendo as he takes on the Chicago Bears. Hey, we have good news and bad news type situation here in the Bay Area. In that game against the Bills, McCaffrey suffered a potentially season-ending PCL injury. The typical recovery period is 3 to 6 weeks, and hey, that's not even the worst news because we're talking, Kyle Shannon's already talked about that being closer to 6 weeks, maybe 6 or 7 weeks. But hey, listen, the bad news, it doesn't end there. Jordan Mason, he's also been put on the IR as of Monday with an ankle injury, meaning Isaac Guerendo, he is the next man up in San Francisco, and we know that the 49ers run game, it is just a machine that keeps on churning. Listen, in that loss to the Bills, Mason, he would go on to average 6 yards per carry, finishing with 78 yards on the ground, while McCaffrey, he produced 53 yards on the ground on his 7 carries. That's an impressive 7.6. Now, for the good news, it doesn't matter who's going to run the ball because we know this 49ers team is going to be able to run the ball no matter what. In 2 games which Guerendo carried the ball at least 10 times, he would rush for 99 and 85 yards respectively, averaging 7.67 yards per carry. This week, Guerendo faces a Bears team that has given up 88 yards on the ground to David Montgomery last week. They also gave up another 87 yards on the ground to Jahmyr Gibbs on Thanksgiving. The Bears, they didn't bring any stuffing to the dinner that week, but hey, over the last 4 weeks, Chicago, they've allowed opposing backs to average 27.53 fantasy points per game and have allowed 701 total yards to the position and 4 touchdowns. Now let's talk about those backs you are sitting this week, and let's talk about Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers as they take on the Philadelphia Eagles. The Carolina Panthers, they've been a much better team offensively in recent weeks. And Chuba Hubbard, he's averaging 15 fantasy points per game this season. His 179.5 fantasy points in 12 games, that has him currently ranked as the RB13 in fantasy. After finishing as a top 12 back in weeks 9 through 12, Hubbard was the RB57 after being held to 3.6 yards per carry on 12 attempts against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in that overtime loss. Now, if it wasn't for that fumble in extra time, the Panthers, they perhaps go on and win that contest. Now, it doesn't get any easier this week against the Philadelphia Eagles, who are holding opposing backs to 15.43 fantasy points per game. That is the 4th fewest over the last 4 weeks. In those 4 weeks, backs are averaging 4 yards per carry, but game scripts have basically said, hey, it don't matter if you're averaging 4 yards per carry because we're only giving up 279 rushing yards and a pair of scores over that period. Last week, Philadelphia, they held Derrick Henry, the NFL's second leading rusher, to 82 yards on 19 attempts. Unfortunately for Hubbard managers, the likelihood of Hubbard seeing 19 carries is less than 5%. Actually, it's probably closer to 2%, but hey, what do I know? Now, the second running back that I'm sitting is Kenneth Walker III of the Seattle Seahawks as they head to the desert to take on the Arizona Cardinals. Walker has averaged 16.7 fantasy points per game this season. The problem is that fantasy football is more of a what have you done for me type lately business, and Walker hasn't averaged more than 14 fantasy points in a game since week number 7. Last week against the Jets, a team that is allowing more than 20 fantasy points per game to the position, Walker was held to 6.6 fantasy points. Walker would finish that game with 49 rushing yards on 19 carries, hauling in 2 of his 3 targets there for negative yardage, and then he had to sit back and watch Zach Charbonnet score from inside the 10-yard line. That's just wrong, people. Now, this week, Walker's opponent, they've been playing much better recently, especially when defending opposing backs. Arizona is ranked 7th over the last 4 weeks, allowing just 17.5 fantasy points per game and 3.55 yards per carry on the ground. And the final back I'm sitting this week, let's stick with the Seahawks-Cardinals matchup in the desert, and let's talk about James Conner. As good as the Cardinals have been in recent weeks, as far as the defense is concerned, Seattle, they've been even better. Seattle allows 14.28 fantasy points per game. That is the second fewest, limiting backs to just 3.57 yards per carry. The New York Jets are probably not the best barometer when it comes to measuring fantasy success, but Seattle, they did hold Breece Hall to 60 yards on the ground and forced him to put the ball on turf on multiple occasions after recovering it once themselves. Now Hall, he was also shut out of the Jets passing game, giving way to Braylon Allen. James Conner, listen, he had a respectable outing last week against a top 5 ranked Vikings fantasy defense against the run, putting up 10 fantasy points against a defense that was only allowing 10.58 fantasy points over to the running back position over the last 4 weeks, and just 16.77 to backs on the season. That was the 3rd fewest. Now, with that all being said, if you want to stay up to date with all the latest news and analysis, head over to RotoBaller.com, or hey, check out the RotoBaller Discord channel where I'm there all the time answering your start and sit questions. We'll see you next time.